We're now recording.
Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Griffin, Senior Program Officer at ACRL. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar offered as part of ACRL's Together Wherever virtual event. Our goal for these webinars is to bring our colleagues together to discuss ways to best meet the needs of the library community during this uncertain time and beyond. We appreciate you being with us today. If you like, please feel free to pop a brief introduction of yourself and say hello in the chat box today while I go over a few reminders. I will also be here to monitor the chat and moderate the questions at the end of the session for our presenters. As previously mentioned, today's session is being recorded. We'll post the link to the recording in the ACRL Together Wherever website, as well as on the ACRL YouTube channel later today. The ALA statement of appropriate conduct does apply to all ACRL events, including virtual events, and we encourage respectful discourse on Twitter using hashtag ACRLTogether2020. Today's presentation will be 1 hour in length, and we'll leave the Zoom room open for an additional 15 to 20 minutes after the presentation for optional networking and questions. When you choose to depart today's session, you'll see a brief evaluation, and we greatly appreciate your thoughts and feedback. Thank you so much in advance. Today's webcast is teaching computer science students about algorithm bias. I'd like to thank our presenters, Shalini Ramachandran, Karen Howell, Steve Cutchin, and Sheree Fu for being with us today. Presenters, please feel free to start whenever you're ready.
All right. Let's see. Hello, everyone. My name is Shalini Ramachandran, and these are the rest of my research team. So we first came together in the fall of 2018 to launch a study on how computer science students perceive algorithm bias and how algorithm bias awareness could be taught in the curriculum. So we focus specifically on computer science students as they're the ones who will enter the workforce as future architects of search engines and automated systems. So we'll summarize key aspects of our study in today's talk, and we hope library workers in our audience can reflect on some of the issues we raise, and we welcome your feedback. All right, so this is the overview of what we will cover. And then the next thing, let's see. So I just wanted to talk about how my own interest got started in this, on this issue, on this topic of algorithm bias. So I was a science and engineering librarian at the University of Southern California, USC. And during my time at USC, Sophia Noble, who was a visiting professor at USC, spoke to USC librarians about racism in search engines and algorithms, which she wrote about in her 2018 book, Algorithms of Oppression. And one example of both gender and racial bias she describes in her book are the results she found on Google after she typed in a search query for Black girls. And this was to help her daughter start research for a school project. And to her shock, most of the top results were pornographic and offensive. So what we see here is, the click of users along with the prioritizing of paid advertisements means that biased and disturbing representations of Black women were being replicated online in Google. So I was the subject librarian for computer science at USC. And Professor Noble's talk got me wondering about how aware our computer science students were about algorithm bias. So our study began to take shape after further conversations with Sheree and Karen, who were librarians at USC. Karen is still at USC, and Steve, who is a computer science professor at Boise State University. All right, so these were two of the study questions we considered, among many others. Is an information literacy component focused on algorithm bias beneficial to offer to students in the computational sciences? And what instructional materials might address the differences between students' perceptions of algorithm bias, and the existing documentation of algorithm bias. All right, so I thought I would establish a couple of definitions as we go forward. First is how algorithms, most of us know what they are, but to kind of state it, algorithms are sets of instructions within computer programs that direct how these programs read, select, process, and analyze data. So they're part of the architecture of much of the internet and also the basis of all automated systems, artificial intelligence, and of course, search engines. And then algorithm bias is what occurs when computer algorithms systematically discriminate against certain content, individuals, or groups in favor of others without a sound basis. And then, so before I get into some of the causes and examples of algorithm bias, I thought I'd present a case of human bias, and more specifically, what's called implicit bias, where the person or group holding the bias is not actively aware of it. So I was recently reading a book on the Rodney King trial. Rodney King was a Black man who was beaten by 4 Los Angeles police officers in 1991. The incident was caught on video by a bystander, and there was a subsequent trial. And all 4 officers, 3 white and 1 Latino, were found not guilty by a predominantly white jury in 1992. So the homogeneous composition of the jury was a concern for the prosecution and many legal observers at the time. After the trial, some of the jury spoke out publicly, and they've always insisted that race did not factor into their decision, that they had been completely rational and unbiased. So for your consideration, here are some of the reflections some years after the trial of Dorothy Bailey, the jury forewoman. I won't read through all of her statements here, but there are many layers to unpack. And what stands out for me immediately is that she identifies the prosecutor's race, but not of the 4 defendants. There are also several racial stereotypes that emerge in her description of the lead prosecutor, Terry White. Most crucially, she doubts his sincerity based on her judgment about his level of emotion. So this is one instance where even when there is strong assertion of fairness, there are unexamined biases that possibly pushed decision-making in that trial in a certain direction. So now, similarly, when we begin to examine bias in computer programming, the possibility of implicit bias entering into algorithm design is a real concern. All right, so here I'm going to talk about 2 examples of algorithm bias. And there are different causes for what brings it about. It could be the type of data, it could be human bias inserted, and so on. And another thing to note is, the more data a machine learning algorithm sees, the better it becomes at the task it performs. So the first case is a case where the data was skewed. So this is a study published in Nature Communication in 2016, where researchers confirmed for the first time that 2 of the top genomic databases, which are in wide use today by clinical geneticists, reflect a measurable bias, a significant bias toward genetic data based on European ancestry over that of African ancestry. So there's a huge gap here, and this gap in genomic data can impact how disease risks are analyzed for people of African descent versus those of European descent. So the second example is, more uncertain as to where the bias is coming in. It could be implicit bias, but in this case, what happened is Compass is a software that's widely used in the US to guide sentencing by predicting the likelihood of criminals reoffending. In May 2016, ProPublica reported that the COMPAS system predicts that Black defendants pose a higher risk of recidivism than they actually do, and the reverse for white defendants. So basically, the system was not working. And Equivent, the company that developed the software, disputes that there is a discrepancy. So it's hard to pinpoint where the bias may have come from because the algorithm is proprietary. So we can like open it up and see what's going on. In terms of predicting who is likely to reoffend, however, there was another more recent study by Julia Dressel and Hani Farid published in Science Advances that shows that the COMPAS system is no better than random, untrained people on the internet in making recidivism predictions. All right, so those were two examples. And with that, I'll kind of pass the discussion to Sheree, who will unpack some of the results from a survey we conducted of computer science students to get a sense of what their thoughts on algorithm bias were.
So as Shalini mentioned, we took a survey. Oh, there we go. We took a survey from December 2018 to March 2019. We conducted this survey of prevailing attitudes and knowledge about algorithm bias. We focused on computer science, undergraduate and graduate students. The aim of our survey was to learn about their mindsets and mental models as it applies to search engines and machine learning algorithms. We received over 780 responses. They came from 3 different universities. So the students from the University of Southern California and the students from California State University, Los Angeles, and from Boise State University took the survey. All 3 institutions have distinctly different student populations. USC has a diverse student body in terms of race and gender. Women comprised 44% of the incoming class in Viterbi's engineering school in 2017. Cal State LA has primarily is a Hispanic serving institution where first generation students are almost 80% of the student population. And Boise State is predominantly white, but has seen an increasing number of non-traditional age students in attendance. So we focused on a variety of statements, but we were really curious about how students thought. So we think some of these students can really help learn how students think about algorithm bias. So I found knowing what students are thinking greatly helps with instruction. So we started our research project with a survey. So I put a link in the chat, and if you could take a few minutes to answer the question as if you were a computer science student. All right, so far we've talked about the purpose of the study and mentioned mental models. Mental models are explanations of how people think. They might sound somewhat familiar because they're in the same family as mind maps, the growth mindset, and core concepts from ACRL's information literacy framework. Mental models have come to mean something from the real world. So you can see in this image how it's possible to map out a process or even a model of algorithm bias. Our students answered a lot of survey questions using the Likert scale. And some of the questions include, do AI algorithms improve over time? Are search engine results good enough for everyday questions? Are search engine results accurate? Are algorithms free from bias? And what is the search engine you use? So a huge percentage of our students use Google. And also a large percentage of students also said that they use search engines 7 days a week. So similarly, another response that really stood out was that computer science students seemed optimistic about the future of AI code. So the first 3 of these questions were answered positively by over 90% of students surveyed. They believe technology is good and useful and will get better. So we also had questions about the quality of search engine results. Are they good enough are they just good enough? And 94% agree that they are good enough for everyday questions. So this is really positive. And how accurate are they? They felt that they agreed that there's pretty accurate at over 80%. So they seem pretty satisfied with what they found. Next comes complete and trustworthiness. So you'll see that the survey shows only 58% agree that search engine results are complete. Only 44% of participants find search engines trustworthy. So these results could be interpreted as an increasing amount of doubt when standards become more rigorous. So we see these positive students who find their results useful do have some concerns about high quality results. And finally, we come to algorithm bias. So students are a little bit less certain about bias in algorithms. If we put 100 computer science students in a room, about 1/3 of them would say that algorithms are bias-free. We might explore what it means to be biased and which algorithms are biased in their minds. How might students reconcile the belief that algorithms may be biased and still use Google on a daily basis? So could it be related to their optimisms? Students are really, something curious happens in the space between their search engine perceptions and their belief that AI algorithms are biased. We might have more nuanced conversations to really learn what their mental models are. So to wrap up, if we're looking into computer science students' minds, we might find extremely positive views about search engines and AI overall, and a few concerns. We hope that their mental models may someday include the ethics of care, founded by philosophers Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings. The ethics of care promotes contextual, caring responses when making decisions. We know computer science students are trained to solve problems, and as they are creating and meeting requirements. They might even someday include actively caring about individuals and their communities as part of their everyday work. So based on our survey findings and experiences, Karen will discuss how we designed and deployed our instruction modules.
Thank you, Sheree. So Shalini has talked about bias and algorithm bias, and Sheree's talked about our survey of computer science students' perceptions. When we started tackling the algorithm bias instruction module, we had so many questions. We spent quite a number of meetings trying to decide what would be the best way to approach the module. And in the end, it came down to deciding upon our goal for the module, which would affect the rest of our decisions. So I'm going to talk about the goal of our module, the content that went into the algorithm bias module, and then how we deployed it and tested it to refine it. Let's see if this is responding. So talking about the goal of the algorithm bias instruction module, it really did boil down to answering three fundamental questions: what, why, and how. So in terms of what, algorithms increasingly permeate our information environment. So many times now we see news articles about AI-driven decision-making, how it is seen as quote unquote more objective than human decision-making. It seems often that they announce new ways of systems, new products and services driven by AI, as if that's an advancement over current processes. So our what in the goal was to raise awareness about algorithm bias and search literacy among the computer science students. And the reason why is to mitigate some of the harms of algorithm bias. As you've heard, algorithm bias can result, even in the best of meaning circumstances, in unintended harm. So what can we as librarians do in working with computer science faculty? We wanted to integrate ethical considerations into the computer science students' model of how they design, implement, and review machine learning algorithms. And in fact, as you will see, this is even more important now as biased search results can affect research and policy. I'll end with a few examples of that. So in looking at the content of algorithm bias, for the module, we decided to focus on a module for undergraduate computer science students, and also basically a one-shot session as opposed to a semester-long class. So the module started with a definition of what algorithm bias is, and we wanted to engage students in recognizing specific examples of algorithm bias. So we discussed two forms of biases. The first was the human bias, the unconscious bias that can become incorporated into the algorithm. And the second form is recognizing the algorithm itself could be biased. And this is unknown bias until the effects emerge that are unexpected and possibly harmful. So we aimed to make this conceptual discussion of algorithm bias more real to the students by incorporating a simulation where they can understand how bias is experienced. To address and mitigate algorithm bias, it's best covered through discussion because there are no simple answers that will fit all the situations. And as we discovered as we were creating the module, the field is evolving rapidly. We can see that technologists, business and corporate interests, and potential government regulation are all involved in addressing the issue of bias. So we decided that we would also include a module for resources for more information that can be kept a little bit more up to date and make the examples more relevant to the students' intrinsic interests. Rather than talking about it conceptually, we wanted to take current examples that we thought the students might easily understand and resonate to. For example, just in the last week, I have come across several examples that I am sure are very relevant to our current computer science students. One of the headings is, "Our weird behavior during the pandemic is messing with AI models," where the top 10 Amazon search terms changed in less than 5 days at the beginning of February. So even though you had a large data set for the machine learning algorithms to run against, you had your algorithms, the circumstances changed in the world where these predictions no longer held true, And as we have all experienced, it had effects on supply chain for inventory. I'll put later into the PowerPoint the link to the site for this article, but there is a graph that shows how we stopped looking for luxury goods and other things and started looking for Purell. Another article that came across recently that can be used to, again, engage students are new tools aimed to tame the pandemic paper tsunami. So many papers are being published now that researchers are having trouble staying on top of the tsunami. And so AI search tools are being developed in order to try and bring the relevant literature to the surface. And yet when you read the article in Science Magazine about this, there's concern that understanding how the algorithm was constructed, some of the materials that these algorithms are going across are not reaching articles behind paywalls. So it is not necessarily a complete picture of published research. Many of the keywords do not match current terms that the researchers are looking for in terms of looking for COVID-19. So we're really just seeing the tip of where algorithm bias in search engines have immediate real-world consequences for actions and potentially for policies and systems. Once we got content together, we started trying to put it together into an instruction module that we would get feedback from students with. So between 2019 to the early spring this year, we made 4 presentations across our 3 institutions. We tested it with both undergraduate and graduate level students. Undergraduate students would be the module that we were testing against. Graduate students we thought would give us some feedback about how students would respond to it in their classes. There are distinctly different student populations across our 3 institutions. And we tested it on ground in seminar and presentation form and online in a class. We got feedback in a variety of ways. We used online assessments. We did a minute paper at the end of the presentation. We did interviews with some of the students, and we used gift cards as incentives to attract students to spend a half an hour with us answering more detailed questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who is actually going to talk about the presentations made themselves.
I should unmute my mic. That would be helpful. Hi, yes, I'm Steve Cutchin, and I'm going to talk about the experiences of presenting the material in the classroom settings and what we learned and what happened when we engaged with the students in the various different sessions. So as Karen said, we held 4 different lectures, 2 at Boise State, 1 at the University of Southern California, the other one at Cal State Los Angeles. The first lecture was a test run, and we solicited input from that one to use as adjustments for the following 3 before we presented the material to the students in the other classes. But before I go into the discussion about that, so as Shalini said at the beginning of the talk, we used what's become one of the standard definitions for algorithm bias by Friedman in '94, which is algorithm bias is computer algorithms that systematically discriminate against certain content, individuals or groups in favor of others without a sound basis. In the module, we spend a fair bit of time discussing the issue of what we mean by systematically, what we mean a bit about discrimination, how the system discriminates, and also what we mean by sound basis. All 3 of those are critical issues for understanding what it means when an algorithm is exhibiting bias. So we have quite a few slides on those topics. But we also spent a bit of time summarizing what we mean by bias. The dictionary has a perfect definition of bias, prejudice in favor of one group or another group compared to another, usually. And the key part of this is bias has a hint of usually in a way considered to be unfair. For the purpose of discussion in the sessions, we boiled bias down effectively. Bias means preference, and when you use the word bias, you're implying that there's something unfair about the preference that you're selecting. That's the definition that we used, and it worked well throughout the presentations. Now we gave an initial test presentation at Boise State University to 30 to 40 computer science students. All of our presentations were to computer science students earning their degrees in computer science. There was differences between the populations, but they're all learning how to write linked lists, all learning how to write computer programs, and they're all going through relatively standardized computer science training programs that share tremendous amounts of overlap. We gave as Karen said in her slide, we gave definitions of bias, a selection of case studies that talked about different types of biases. We solicited their feedback and their input, all this in the test section, and we asked for input on potential impact of algorithm bias. What did we find out in this first session that we had with the students in these classes? Well, we learned a couple of specific things. One that I felt was surprising was that what I found was that most of the students were unfamiliar with the notion of algorithm bias. So these are sophomores and juniors who, when asked, do you know what algorithm bias is? None of them raised their hand, and the majority said, I'm unfamiliar. No, this isn't something I've seen before, which I felt was surprising. One student in particular raised a concern that was not wholly unexpected, and that's that he argued that algorithm bias doesn't exist. He expects algorithms to be biased to the correct answer, that computer programs just run their code and the answer is correct or not correct, and that's the bias that should occur in algorithms. Computer science students across the board in all their programs are taught to write codes that are provably correct, highly testable. They're trained in many courses that your program is correct or not correct. So it's not surprising after years of teaching in these courses that they would be exhibiting a notion that the program is correct or not correct. So this should not have come as a surprise to us, and it didn't in particular. Other students also expressed a bit of a concern that the examples given were too distant for them. They didn't see it how related to the material that they were learning in their courses, because they aren't writing large search engines or AI ML programs for solving major scale programs or problems in the world. Or some of them exhibited a little bit of, this is a little bit of too controversial. They didn't feel too comfortable trying to figure out how they could address it. And they were made a little bit nervous, although that last one did not occur very often, but it was something that was raised. So based on this feedback, we went back and adjusted our module, our content that we had to address this particular topic. The key change that we realistically made was that we spent time explaining contextually what we mean by algorithm bias. So in computer science students are taught to write programs that do sorting and ordering and organizing. And if you're given a set of books, all with their Dewey Decimal numbers labeled on them, and I ask you to sort them based on their Dewey Decimal numbers, if I ask 100 librarians to do that, I will get all the books sorted in the same order. And the ones that aren't sorted, almost all the librarians would agree, oh, those are out of order and you should correct that order. So those are the type of programs that are correct. If we as humans know how to always get a correct solution for a particular problem, if we have a sequence of steps, if an algorithm exists that we can say, yes, this is the correct answer, then those programs are not the ones we're talking about at all when we talk about algorithm bias. If the program or the problem we're applying to the computer program to, we can't agree as humans what the correct answer is, or we don't have a way to determine, oh, so the recidivism prediction of prisoners is the perfect example. If you put 100 criminologists in a room and ask them to predict the recidivism rate, what will happen for individual prisoners, they'll often be wrong. They will not have a consistently reliable way to guarantee what the correct answer is. So programs that operate on those types of problems for which we don't have a determined mechanism for always getting a correct solution, those are the types of programs we're talking about when we talk about algorithm bias. And a good example of this for a search term is if I type in, what is the best approach to grow a small town? That would be very difficult to answer without a computer. So what should the search result come back with? And if I give a large collection of software developers and say, go write a search engine that will give us this solution, they would have a hard time coming up with an agreement amongst themselves as to what the best search solution is for this and what the best search result is for this. So those are the types of programs we're talking about when we're talking about algorithm bias. So we integrated this into the module and used it in the follow-on presentations. And I may have to go. I have several slides to go through. I don't want to run out of time, so I may go a little quickly. So we gave 3 follow-on lectures, one at Boise State, one at the University of Southern California, and then one at Cal State Los Angeles in spring of 2020, but that one had to be done online because of the COVID pandemic. What did we learn based on the revised version of the presentation? So at Boise, all of the courses, so these were all computer science majors, almost completely undergraduates. The University of Southern California had the biggest difference in demographics between the other two in that it had the most international students and most master's students present. At Boise, the presentations were all well received. The students engaged with the material and were open to discussing the examples that were presented, so they went well. We didn't have any real defensiveness in any of the presentations, so we could have some engaged discussions in the topic. The students at Boise State were unfamiliar with algorithm bias. It was more or less the first time they had heard about it or were willing to discuss it, or heard about it or able to discuss it in a classroom setting. One of the results of presenting the material to them was that if a situation involving potential algorithm, if a situation involving an algorithm was unclear, they tended to argue that bias was not present. So if they were seeing a problem, which it could be algorithm bias or not, they almost always said, there's probably not algorithm bias. And they did not agree with each other if Google search was biased or not. In the lecture at the University of Southern California, they were familiar with algorithm bias at the beginning of the lecture. They had more exposure to it. However, I mean, they engaged in almost the same way as the Boise State students did, and they were willing to discuss and examine the case studies meaningfully. However, if the situation was unclear as to whether algorithm bias was present or not in the problem, they tended to conclude that algorithm bias was present. And this was pretty consistent amongst all of the students during the lecture period. And that class felt that overwhelmingly agreed that Google search was biased, whereas it was a much different response received at Boise State. I was actually quite surprised with the strength of agreement that Google search is a biased search engine. Remember, these are all the same educational programs. They're all computer science students being taught in computer science program, being trained on software development, computer programming. They share a tremendous overlap in the material that they're studying. And then at Cal State Los Angeles, Again, the Cal State Los Angeles one, the students were highly unfamiliar with algorithm bias. This was one of the first times that they'd seen it in a classroom setting, had a discussion about it. However, in a way similar to the University of Southern California, they tended to argue that bias was present if the situation was unclear. So they shared that commonality with the University of Southern California. They also felt strongly, while not quite as overwhelming as University of Southern California, they felt strongly that Google search was biased in its responses. For those who asked the demographics of the three different groups, the Boise State one is predominantly domestic students, predominantly a Caucasian environment. University of Southern California had a lot of international students and a lot more master's students present. The Cal State Los Angeles is, and Sheree could correct me on this, she knows the most about it, is a minority serving institution with a large Hispanic presence across the campuses as well. So there's definite differences in the demographics between the different groups. So, and there were definite, the attitudes were quite different across the different groups, but they all engaged well with the material and they were willing to work through and have a discussion about what was happening in the different algorithms. So let's go on a little bit. So what lessons did we learn from the different places when we presented the materials to the classes? One was that what is perceived as a sensitive topic by instructors. So if you talk to computer science instructors, you will find many who are a bit nervous about broaching the subject of algorithm bias in their classes. However, this wasn't borne out in the classroom sessions. The students were more comfortable. None of the students in the discussions for the follow-on 3 were uncomfortable having calm and reasonable discussions about the presence of algorithm bias. So that was quite refreshing. I really liked that. I do want to point out, computer science students are highly analytical groups. They are highly analytical students. They will split hairs in the discussions, okay? So when you have a conversation about it, they'll want to know details. And they will ask far more questions that are presented in, I've got to hurry. So what do we like? So problems that are presented should have an emphasis on problems with inherent ambiguity. It's important to show the process for the systems as how it's making the determinations for the outcome, so you can show where the algorithm bias is introduced by the computer program. And it's important to select examples that come from a place of good faith for those who are involved and engaged in the work, because that shows us a systemic problem and does not depend upon the intention of the developers. And that's one of the key things. Algorithm bias is a systemic issue, and so the intent of those who create the software needs to be removed from the discussion because it's about the behavior of the program itself. And so it works to your advantage in presenting the material if it's clear that all involved were trying to solve the problem. So what are some good example cases that we did present? And we have quite a few more, but effectively we're very close to out of time here. So one was an excellent example in CNN Business. Steve Wozniak says Apple Card discriminated against his wife. So Apple Card gives a credit score, and it's a computer generated credit score based on financial records, financial data, and existing models from the financial services industry put into a computer by Apple engineers. Steve Wozniak and his wife are effectively the same legal entity. They have the same assets, everything is owned in common, they have the same resources. Woz's credit score was far higher than his wife's. There's no comparison. It was significantly better than his wife, and yet in fact they have the exact same financial assets and financial resources and payment records. So it makes no sense whatsoever. This was a good example. It's applicable to the real world, it's not controversial, and it's almost impossible to argue that gender bias wasn't involved and that the computer program was generating the algorithm, was selecting the scores based on what humans had put into it. Now, what's particularly interesting about this one is that another person had detected the same bias and had reported it, but it wasn't picked up by CNN Business because that person wasn't famous, which I like this case because it shows that actually There's also bias in reporting. It wasn't until Steve Wozniak, a very famous person, reported it that CNN felt it was worth putting on their website, even though they had received an early report from another individual. The Wall Street Journal had a very nice case study about how Google interferes with its search algorithm and changes your results. Now, what's particularly good about this one is that Google doesn't publish its basis for its search. It doesn't publish it at all. So we don't know actually what its criteria is for making its determination about its search. So we don't know its basis. As such, having a discussion about whether or not it's interfering with its search results is highly suspect. For all we know, they may be doing exactly what they've always intended to. So this was an excellent example to have a discussion about what it means by a sound basis. So that's another one. But the best result, the best case study available is published in Science by Obermeyer of 2019 on dissecting racial bias in an algorithm used to manage the health of populations. This is a great use case for talking about algorithm bias. So a hospital and a collection of insurance wanted to develop an algorithm that could calculate and predict health risk assessments for human populations. They manage approximately 200 million health cases, so this is a widespread utilization. And they wanted a metric that they could generate that assesses the health risk for individuals. And they threw a computer program at this. And they had to come up with a model and a computer system to do that. And they asked themselves, what was the question? How do I assess health risk? And they came up with the idea of, well, if I get treated for a far more deadly illness than something else, so cancer versus setting a broken bone, the costs of treating cancer are going to be much higher than treating a broken bone. So they estimated that health risk was related to the cost of treatment. I'll ask, does anyone have an idea with a problem with using cost of treatment as an indicator of health risk? Well, we have some very nice answers, vary by locations, insurance, very inconsistent, impact of health literacy. That's the nice one, is impact of health literacy. If you don't get treated, your costs are low. And as it turned out, the health risks for African Americans were always underestimated versus the health risks for white Americans, for Caucasian Americans. The result was stark, clear, obvious, and unavoidable. So healthcare costs are not a good proxy for health risk, simply because if one group, for some reason, doesn't get healthcare when it needs to, its healthcare will be lower, and you will predict they're at less risk of health for illness, when in fact the opposite could be the case. They could be at more risk because they're not receiving care at all. So it was very poorly done. But it's an excellent example for algorithm bias because it's highly relevant to the real world. It shows how one particular disadvantaged group can be unfairly impacted by an algorithm. Everybody involved was trying to address the problem. The developers were trying to come up with a network for accurately assessing healthcare risk. It was all done in good faith. It's clearly explainable. The algorithm, you can show exactly how the algorithm itself is generating the bias in its operation and where it's impacting, and the consequence of the system is measurable. So these factors combined together make an excellent result for persuading and having discussion about algorithm bias in front of computer science students who are highly analytical. So this is probably the best case example available. Okay, and with that, because we're running low on time, what are our next steps? What do we hope to do next? Where do we take things as a follow-on? We're going to continue with the work. We're going to solicit more feedback. We're going to break down our use cases into better examples of algorithm bias, implicit bias, program bias, data set bias. There's a variety of different types, and we'd like to engage in a little more. There's an article that's forthcoming in November. And finally, the materials, the survey, we will make those available through GitHub so that anyone who would like to get access to them can have access to them and they can be widely accessible. So we'll publish the results on GitHub for anybody who would like to utilize them. And with that, I'm going to turn the talk back over to Shalini for finishing up.
All right, so this brings us to our conclusion. We kind of lay out a librarian roadmap here. So as Karen pointed out, algorithm bias has gained a lot of attention recently in popular culture, in the media, as well as in the field of computer science. Faculty in many universities have started to design dedicated courses to address the issue. The coursework is still very new. And it'll be valuable as we move forward to see what methods are working in terms of raising awareness of bias, as well as improving students' ability to recognize bias and improve upon biased algorithms. Now, librarians, because of our longstanding history of advocating for fairness in information systems, are also uniquely poised to disseminate instruction on this topic to students from a variety of disciplines, not just computer science. So we hope the partnership our team at Boise State, Cal State LA, and USC built with faculty in computer science can serve as a prototype for future collaborations between librarians and faculty in algorithm-heavy subjects. As we saw with many of the examples presented, algorithm bias can cause significant harm and perpetuate existing inequities. So our goal in this study was to develop an actionable instruction plan that raises awareness about about algorithm bias among computer science students, and also, invite them to view bias mitigation as a necessary component of the software lifecycle. And in the long run, social injustices cannot, of course, be rooted out with just coursework and information literacy modules. However, we do feel education can play a part in the process. So with that, we end our presentation and we welcome questions from you.
Thank you all so much. This is Megan at ACRL. Thank you to our presenters and for all of you for being here. If you would please go ahead and put any questions that you have in the chat box. If you can, please remember to click in the chat box so the message goes to all panelists and attendees, as the default is just set to all panelists. We have about 7 minutes remaining for questions, and I'll go ahead and ask the first one from Melanie. Are the case studies part of the module or just a presentation? And by module, do they mean an LMS integrated module or simply a workshop?
Yep. So I'll guess I'm still unmuted. So the module in its present form is a presentation that was given to the students in various different courses. And somebody asked, well, it was presented via Zoom and it was presented in person at the different spaces with the test survey, test before and after, the assessment materials, and then the presentation materials. We're hoping to expand it and make it available in some different formats. And we will definitely make it available through GitHub so people can access it.
Thank you. And the next question from Susan. What was the second example that Karen gave, something about the tsunami after the Amazon example?
Oh, okay. It's called New Tools. Let me think. Is that the one you're talking about? New Tools to Tame Pandemic Paper Tsunami? I'll put the link in the chat. Here you go. I think one of the challenges we came across is that this field, when we started, of course, there was some attention because of Sophia Noble's book and some others, but it was still somewhat academic. But as we kept going, we started finding more and more people becoming aware of the real world harms of bias, especially, I don't know if people have seen recently a lot of concern about facial recognition software being used, and IBM has decided to stop offering their product. It's not exactly clear if they're going to stop their research. And Amazon just yesterday announced that they're going to have a hiatus for a year. But more and more, the examples are becoming clearer. And that's why I think keeping up with some of these current examples are good, because each person that's wanting to do an algorithm bias module needs to be cognizant of your local audience that you're working with, and perhaps have a set of different types of examples that might be more of a hook to what their students' concerns really are.
Thank you. Another question: was it difficult to convince computer science faculty to let them talk to their students about the subject?
Well, I am computer science faculty, so it wasn't hard to talk to my students.
I do think that this was one of our challenges. That's one reason we started with Boise State, because it was our in. But Steve had to talk to some of his colleagues to find a faculty member that would make space for him to give a guest lecture. At USC, we were trying to find a way to do this. There certainly could have been individual faculty members, but we were trying to also look for a variety of circumstances. So I repurposed our Lunch and Learn series that we have, where we do a Lunch and Learn series that is pretty popular with computer science students. It's primarily aimed at international students, but a lot of them are computer science students. And the chair of computer science allowed us to, well, I sent him the flyer and he sent it out to all the students. And when I double checked with our student workers who were computer science students, they told me that was the right mechanism, because all of them, whenever the chair sends them something, they all immediately open his email and go look at it. So we definitely had a great response for that one. And Sheree should talk about her work with Cal State LA to find that faculty member.
Yes, so I ended up talking to my the dean of the computer science department, and she was very excited. She also mentioned creating kind of a, well, we talked about how it would be great to incorporate ethics throughout the computer science curriculum, and this would be part of it. So I think we've been really lucky to have supportive faculty. It does take a lot of footwork and meetings and building relationships.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one final question. Did the students have ideas for moving forward to mitigate algorithm bias?
I wanted to talk about that one specifically because yes, they did. Although I'll have to say the location where they had the students at University of Southern California had many ideas for ways to mitigate algorithm bias. Lots of different ideas in lots of different fashions. They really wanted to go off and talk about that a lot, from regulation to software development, software lifecycle, review boards, industry activity. The other two, now that could be because there was more, I'm not 100% certain, the demographics were very different. Boise State, very few students suggested ideas. And then at Cal State LA, there weren't, but the Cal State LA presentation was very different because it was an online one on Zoom in the middle of the pandemic, and it was more difficult to get very strong engagement with that audience because Zoom's not great for really strong engagement. If anybody else has anything to add?
Hi, this is Lauren from ACRL. We are out of time now for this portion of the Q&A, so I'm going to stop the recording.